Hello, everyone, and welcome in this digital event. I'm Bruno Lété, a senior fellow with the German Marshall Fund, and I'm very pleased that today we have the pleasure to welcome our panelists and our viewers on both sides of the Atlantic. So good afternoon, Europe, good morning, America, and for my own part, greetings from Brussels. First things first, I also want to express our thanks for our partners in this event, the US Embassy to Belgium. They have been a great support in making this event happening. So again, many thanks. The topic of the discussion today is very straightforward. How can we strengthen transatlantic relations? This is the question we want to ask today. And since 2020 marks the 75th anniversary of the end of the World War II, we wanted to travel back a little bit in time and really look at when the foundations were laid for a strong partnership between Europe and the United States, and see which lessons from the past we could still use today or in the future. I think we also want to have this conversation because we can never take this transatlantic cooperation for granted, whether it comes to trade or science, defense, culture. History tells us that the transatlantic partnership revisits itself at regular intervals. A bit like in a family, the dynamic of the relationship changes sometimes, and the moment for such review could perhaps announce itself soon again. So there are, of course, domestic factors that shape the relationship, but also external elements need to be considered. Take, for instance, the role of other powers like China or Russia. So in sum, I think that's what we want to talk about today. What priorities lie ahead for the transatlantic relations? Which risks do transatlantic relations face, and how do we address these risks? Which lessons of the past do we need to remember? And also perhaps one final question, how can we actually communicate the value of transatlantic relations to the next generation on both sides of the Atlantic? Fortunately for me, as your humble moderator, I do not need to answer these complex questions myself. I'm actually joined by three exceptional speakers, each in their own right, and I would like to introduce them to you briefly. First of all, Baron Frans van Daele, who is a Minister of State of Belgium. I mean, this is only one among many other titles and roles that you have played in your career. Most recently also as head of cabinet to the King of the Belgians, King Philip, but you also were an ambassador of Belgium to the United States and ambassador of Belgium to NATO. So a warm welcome to you in this event. Next, Walter Russell Mead, a distinguished fellow in strategy and statesmanship at the Hudson Institute. But here again, I could also mention your many other titles and affiliations, but as an author, I'd like to say that your books and research are widely hailed for having changed the way Americans think about American foreign policy. So it's thank you very much for joining us. And last but certainly not least, Constanze Stelzenmüller, a senior fellow at the Center of United States and Europe at the Brookings Institution. But I also have the privilege to call you a former colleague of mine at the German Marshall Fund. So it's a true pleasure to welcome you. And I think I don't exaggerate when I say that your work on German, European, and transatlantic security policy serves as a source of inspiration on both sides of the Atlantic. So thank you very much to all of you for joining. This conversation is on record. We'll first turn to our speakers for brief comments, but then we'll also turn to you, the audience, for questions and comments. We really want this to be an interactive debate, so feel free to use the Zoom chat function. I'll be closely monitoring the feed and transfer your questions to our panelists. So after these few house rules, without much further ado, let me perhaps turn to you, Baron van Daele, and maybe start with this question, if I may, and tap from your memories as Belgian ambassador to the United States. That wasn't a time that was perhaps not so easy for transatlantic relations when there was a significant opposition to the invasion of Iraq. Given the theme of our event today, in your experience, what have been the foundations that you relied on back then to strengthen the relationship between Belgium and the US?
Well, that's the period you're referring to was indeed a period of sportsmanship. Il faut être sportif. What helped a lot. From the very beginning I was there, I identified a number of groups who were willing to listen to me, which was not the case of everybody. But I worked a lot with them, and after some time I got some traction. And as, of course, the war in Iraq got in its own difficulties, more and more people started to say, well, maybe your position, which was a clear and explicit anti-Iraq war position, was not that crazy after all. And on top of that, we had deep pockets in the sense that we have a long-standing, close relationship with the United States, and so the discussions and the debates we had, after all, rested on a kind of a historical credibility of a good house friend. But if you want me to say a couple of things on the situation today,
yes.
As we all know, foreign policy is the continuation of domestic politics with other means, and I would like to say very briefly 2 or 3 things on the domestic politics before saying something on the new foreign policy we are going to delve into. I was astonished, I still am in a way, that how many Europeans thought that the end of democracy was nigh, and everywhere I try to explain the strength of the institutional system of the United States, which at least in my grammar is what defines the United States as a state. But most people were not aware or not convinced that the institutional system is very stress-proof in the United States. So that tells a lot about the way the Europeans are seeing the Americans and vice versa. We always start with misunderstanding each other before we find the exit. The second domestic point I would like to point out, Bruno, is that how easily checks and balances which have been built in that institutional system become gridlock if politics become partisan. And now that's, of course, there we'll find the importance of the elections in Georgia, the senatorial elections, and as well all the stories we hear about who may be the next Secretary of Defense and so on. And then the third point is how constrained, and that brings me already closer to foreign policy, how constrained the margin of maneuver of the president-elect is. On the one hand, he will have a political adversary who is not yet gone, contrary to what is the habit in the United States. Would I say we have only one president at a time? Now you may have a taste of what having a shadow opposition leader and a shadow cabinet mean. Just ask our British friends. And then, of course, on the other side of the divide, President-elect Biden has to take account of the left wing of his party. So I think his margin of maneuver is a bit constrained, but then he has chosen up till now excellent people, so that will help to get out of the bind. That is a couple of remarks on domestic politics as seen from Brussels. A word on foreign policy. We have had basically as Europeans 12 years of neglect, 4 years of malign neglect, 8 years of benign neglect. Remember the pivot to Asia. And maybe a number of Europeans were not that unhappy about this situation of neglect. But I think all the signals we are all hearing and receiving is that the Biden administration wants to engage with us as close, long-standing allies, and they are going to make a real effort to try and find common ground on which we can act together. Now, where is this common ground going to be? There will be a lot about values-based foreign policy, and multilateral foreign policy, going back to the climate agreements, Iran, which has become more and more complicated as time goes by, the WTO, the World Health Organization. We all know that it's obvious, but every time you delve into each individual issue, you see how difficult they come. Values-based foreign policy is a very difficult art to practice, and we all end up in between a rock and a hard place. But I think Biden is really, and his people really intends to go down that route, but I think they are aware of the limits of that approach. That's the first thing, values-based. Second is a number of issues which I call economic, and that is a very difficult issue is the digital market. We are expecting the Commission to come out now this month with a draft Digital Services Act and a draft Digital Market Act. And this is, of course, an issue of huge economic importance to the United States. So finding common ground there will require a lot of of negotiating skills. But I think on both sides of the Atlantic they have them. But it will not be an easy one. Then there is trade and TTIP. From what I hear, there is no no likelihood that TTIP as such will be resuscitated, but there will be many other sectorial agreements to try and get our norms and standards closer, and that is a good thing for both of us. We will have to try to work on COVID, and particularly on how we stimulate the economy on both sides of the Atlantic, preferably in a way that both stimulus packages reinforce each other than the contrary. So that's on the economy, and the European Commission has very precise ideas on that. Charles Michel, President of the European Council, as well. I think they have already invited the president-elect to come to Brussels to have a meeting with the European Council, and that is a good thing to try and find each other. Now, the third element is about strategy, strategic interest, and there are two in the transatlantic relation itself, and there is China. On China, well, we will have an occasion to talk about that, but that will be a tough one, and it will be the tougher to find common ground with the United States, as inside Europe, the different players are deeply divided on the way we have to approach China, how we have to deal it, how we with that country, how we have to put limits to what they are doing. And as we are divided, it's of course a bit difficult then to find the common ground we obviously need with the United States. The second strategic element is the transatlantic relationship itself. I think the danger of falling back in the type of transatlantic relationship we had, let's say 10 years ago or whatever, and replay the same old film is there. I think we can make a bit a shift in how we are approaching transatlantic relations by with two elements. First of all, I think we should get rid of this discussion about who is spending what on defense. And I sense a certain willingness with people around Biden to say, well, we understand, and we understand now that soft power counts as well, and there you Europeans are doing much more than we Americans. So we should at least find a kind of a speaking arrangement between the two of us, instead of going again at each other with a subject which will not be solved by just shouting at each other. The second point transatlantically, which I find important, is the total absence of a common platform. I was ambassador in NATO, and maybe I'm not, I think, revealing a secret, but in these years I was at NATO, there was never, ever any strategic discussion. There was, if there were strategic discussions, they happened between Washington, London, Paris, and Berlin, and nowhere else, but not at NATO. And I presume that that situation has not changed at all. So I'm convinced, but that's my conviction, that we need a much stronger, regular, common platform between Americans and Europeans, where we talk about what our common ground is and what our common interests are. And it may sound strange, it never happened at NATO. Voila.
Ambassador, thank you very much for setting the tone with your straightforward thoughts. I think I hear you say that there are certainly some great prospects at the horizon for the transatlantic relationship, but that doesn't mean that everything will be a smooth ride. There will still remain some obstacles and challenges to consider. With that, let me move to Walter Russell Mead. And perhaps a brief question from me as well. I mean, over the past decades, we've seen different forms of US foreign policy, whether full reliance on multilateralism or retreat to more unilateral actions. What trends do you expect now, Professor, if I may ask you, and which formula perhaps serves US interests the best? You will need to unmute yourself.
I am now unmuted.
Thank
it's great
you.
to be here, struggling with technology. And it's an honor to be here with Baron, and it is a pleasure and an honor to be here with Dr. Stelzenmüller, whose work I deeply admire. Look, I think the one thing we know about U.S. foreign policy is that it will continue to change. In my book, Special Providence, I talked about 200 years of debates in the United States. The debates have actually not changed very much. The positions in the debates, should the U.S. be trying to integrate with a global order? I mean, in the 19th century, that was really a discussion about our relationship with Great Britain, which was then the power upholding this global order, so to speak. Should we try to oppose that order? Is it a danger to American democracy? Should our foreign interests primarily commercial? Are they strategic? Is it in our interest to try to avoid getting entangled in other people's quarrels around the world? Should we be trying to convert the world, whether to Christianity or to democracy or some other thing? We will continue to debate these questions for a long time, and this will sometimes annoy our international interlocutors because we change our minds. And I think when I wrote Special Providence, I was warning that there was a sort of a populist nationalist tradition, I call them Jacksonians, in the United States, and that if one didn't think about them and think about how to bring them in some way to American foreign policy, we might be headed for a real crisis. We've had this crisis. It may not be over. And I think that the question of trying to integrate, to find a way for America to unify itself or to come to an understanding internally as a basis for any kind of continuity in foreign policy remains very much on the table. I would agree with the remarks that President-elect Biden is going to be somewhat constrained, even if the Democrats win both of the special elections in Georgia, which seems unlikely, but is possible. There are enough conservative Democrats, and I'm thinking particularly of Senator Manchin in the Senate, to mean that you won't have the Senate will remain a kind of an institutionally conservative force in the American system. But I think you're also going to have the issue that anyone signing an executive agreement with the United States, whether it's President-elect Biden returning to the climate treaty or some form of the JCPOA, will know that agreement is only as strong as the political consensus behind the policy, and that without Senate ratification of a treaty, which, because it takes a supermajority of 2/3, is virtually impossible in almost all cases, presidents in the United States do not have the legal power to bind the U.S. government or to bind their successors when making international agreements. That's a fundamental difference between the European and American systems, and it is not going away. And so the lack of consensus in the United States about foreign policy will remain a force in international relations, because other countries will understand a little better perhaps now what it is that they are or are not getting when the President of the United States signs a piece of paper. So this is a difficulty. It's a difficulty for the United States. It's a difficulty for our partners, but it's also a reality and needs to be borne in mind. I guess when I think more broadly about the situation of the transatlantic relationship, think of it as a relationship that was formed after the greatest upheavals in modern history, the 2 world wars, and also after a century with the Industrial Revolution of deep and bitter class conflict within countries and nationalist conflicts between them. And the transatlantic relationship was a sort of both a contributor to and a product of a stabilization of the international system after World War II. And to some degree, this reflects in my mind the maturing of the Industrial Revolution. That is, societies had kind of figured out the way that you manage the financial sector of an industrial economy, the industrial sector. How do you balance between the welfare state and the needs of enterprise and so on and so forth? Not that there weren't debates. After World War II, there was much a fundamental question about what a Western state should look like. And there was a kind of a great moderation in politics. That was the basis. That internal stability, I think, was a major factor in producing the external stability that we saw in the transatlantic relationship. That you had countries whose regimes, all right, you know what, if the Christian Democrats are replaced by the Social Democrats, this is not a revolution either at home or abroad. Things are settled, we're moving ahead. I would argue that today we are actually in the process of moving from a more stable situation to a more unstable one. That is, that the information revolution is overthrowing and subverting the foundations of domestic order in many countries, and therefore making the task of international diplomacy and coordination much more difficult as well. It's easy, and in politics you hear a lot of this, of populists blaming the elites for their stupidity, their corruption, or elites blaming other elites for particular political errors that led to some distressing result. I think it's actually more realistic to say that the transformation of the economy, of the firm, of social discourse through social media, these cascading waves of change are posing a technocratic elite with problems to which there are no solutions that we now know. We will know in 25 years very easily how to do a lot of things that right now we don't understand, like how does one deal with a phenomenon like Facebook, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, or deep fakes. These are new, and as they come to us, we can't sort of look in the cookbook for the recipe as to how to deal with these problems. And so we are going to see governance is less satisfactory to the governed, because the government is confronting problems, whether it's of the left or the right or the center or anything else, that do not have known solutions. Society is once again in the kind of unknown ground that we saw, say, between 1850 and 1950. And I think the process of transformation is accelerating, and the corrosive effect on social institutions and social norms is accelerating. And that's happening within each country in the Atlantic world. It's happening at the level of the Atlantic Alliance, but of course it's also happening, and in many ways at an even greater intensity and pace, outside the Atlantic world. Mm-hmm. So we are now, I think this is the fundamental lesson for all of us. We have passed from an era of peacefully administering the heritage that was left to us by our ancestors who produced a great settlement. That's actually the role that all of us, I think, were educated to play and have an expectation to play, and that our institutions were set up to play. We are now much more in the position of a Marshall, of a Schumann, of these people who are, there is an abyss of chaos opening at our feet. We do not know what the answers are. We may, in fact, be at the beginning of an accelerating series of shocks. And so we're going to have to, I think, come back to an idea that has been absent or marginalized in the time of peaceful administration of a well-functioning, well-ordered system. And that is kind of, we have to be looking for greatness and heroism. I am not, by the way, talking about making America great again when I say these things, but I do think that there is a sense in which we are going to be tested in a much more fundamental way, and we will see what our real values are.
Yeah, I hate to be to do this, but just in the interest of time, I also would like to pass the word to our colleagues. And thank you so much for these initial remarks. I wrote down, you said U.S. foreign policy will continue to change, basically, but the world is changing too, and fast. So I would like to come back perhaps to that as well. Over to Dr. Stelzenmüller. If I may tap on your experience and expertise, Germany has always been essential to the transatlantic relationship. How essential are US-German relations today for the transatlantic partnership?
Well, first off, Bruno, thank you very much for inviting me to speak on this panel, together with Baron Frans van Daele and Walter Russell Mead, whom I've indeed known for a long time. It's a pleasure to be here today. I would much rather be sitting somewhere with you in person, preferably in Belgium, with the prospect of Belgian food later on, but since that isn't available, this is a very good second best. On the centrality of Germany, honestly, I think, Bruno, you know me well enough to know that I am not a make Germany great again sort of person. And while I think that Germany is one of the anchor powers in the European Union and on the European side of NATO, I would also perhaps not overestimate its importance. It is, I think, true that without Germany putting its economic and I think its diplomatic weight behind things in Europe, you will not see much progress on things these days. And this has a great deal to do not so much with the how great Germany is again, but the sort of domestic travails of other major powers. Such as the UK, which is still mired in Brexit, and France as well. I would like to, without going over the same ground as the preceding speakers, perhaps make some larger points, if I may, speaking to the topic of our panel. And while I agree with Baron van Daele about all the constraints that we're going to see, and I would in fact put this even more brutally, I would say that it is entirely possible, given the fact that I think 40 of the newly elected Democrats in the House gained their seats by less than 2 percentage points, it is entirely possible that in the 2022 elections, we could see the House flipping again and go into Republican hands because Americans like divided government. My first point. My second point is one I think made by both predecessors, but which again I want to put to you more starkly. I think given what we are now seeing from President Trump himself and from the Republican leadership, we are going to see a degree of fundamental opposition against the Biden administration on all levels that will make the Tea Party and the Freedom Caucus look like Sunday softball practice in the park. And that these things will be enormous constraints on the Biden administration. For Europe, that means we are looking at a window of, I would say, 18 to 24 months to try and make the transatlantic relationship more resilient against future shocks and crises, which are sure to come. And in the middle of a historic multi-crisis, the end of which we are still not seeing. The pandemic is raging here in this country. It's raging in Europe. We are seeing a historic economic, social, and political crisis, and I would say a constitutional crisis, to the extent that for the past 4 years, we have had an American president challenging pretty much all of the fundamental values of the US Constitution on any given day. That said, I also want to make a pitch for saying that this election was a triumph of democracy and of America's democratic resilience. And I want to make that point very strongly. 150 million people, more than 150 million people went to vote. And they didn't just mail in ballots. Many of them stood in line for hours or whole days to submit their vote in person. And from both sides of the aisle, you saw perfect symmetric political mobilization in this election with a turnout that hasn't been seen in over 100 years. The process, as we now know, and despite the assertions of Rudy Giuliani and others, worked pretty well. There are very few cases of fraud or intimidation or other things. And institutions, the certifiers and the courts have stood firm against the attempts by the administration to intimidate them. I find that remarkable and very moving. And I think it's a lesson to all of us. But I will also say to you that and again, you know, Walter knows I'm a constitutional lawyer by training, and I wrote my German doctoral thesis on democracy and American constitutional law, a subject which for many years I thought I would never need again, and turns out to have been pretty useful to study. This country has something of a tradition of popular and populist politics and political chaos. And in many ways it has stood, its constitutional order has stood the test of time in ways that other countries have not had to. But I have also never seen a political establishment question deliberately the fundamental values of representative democracy in the way that we are seeing now. I find that astounding, and that is new. And that will remain, to me, one of the single greatest concerns of the political period that we're going into. That said, I think that one of the great challenges for us on both sides of the Atlantic, because I see similar challenges to democracy in all of our domestic polities, including in Germany. I think one of the great challenges for us is going to be to make our domestic operating systems resilient against the huge transformational shifts that Walter was just talking about. I agree with Walter that this is not a moment for technocratic sort of managing compromise and sort of smithing consensus and so on, although we will need that too. We are truly in an architect's moment. And I have to say, I personally rather relish that. Bruno, you may have heard me say this when we were colleagues, that I grew up in a Germany that I thought was as very sort of cautious and fearful within the boundaries of limited sovereignty. And I remember being taught at law school by teachers who essentially said, this basic law is perfect. You will never have to redesign any of it. All we're asking of you in your professional lives will be to occasionally dip a feather in machine oil and apply a tiny drop of oil to some of the joints. More will never be asked of you. And I remember going back from law school to my parents and saying, you know, I think, you know, this can't be realistic. Surely, you know, surely constitutional change, you know, is going to be a bit larger than that. And here we are. But on the other hand, I don't think that this is an impossible task. I do think that we are looking at essentially an engineering challenge, looking at the machinery of representative governance and asking ourselves how to make this functional. Functional meaning, how do we return it to the ability to solve the problems of governance in a way that makes voters trust representative democracy? Because our failure to do that is what has driven them into the arms of the populace. I'm going to leave it at that with one final point that hasn't been mentioned. The other thing that this election was about was a generational shift from the boomer generation and the 1989 generation to which I belong. I suppose I'm also from the tail end of the boomers, to be quite frank, to the generations that have grown up with political and international dysfunctionality, with endless wars, with global threats like climate change and pandemics, and for whom international competition, conflict, and deepening interdependence are facts of life, but which they want to see addressed by politics. And they will only trust and vote for politicians whom they believe capable of grappling with these issues. And I think that one of the things I truly admire about how Biden is going about choosing his cabinet is that I think he's making clear signs that he has understood that he himself is also a bridge, a generational bridge, and not just a unifier among political camps. And I'm going to leave it there, and I look forward to discussion.
Thank you, Constanze. Thank you for zooming out 10,000 feet and actually give us this tour de table of the issues at stake. So the Q&A feed is very active. So I will just waste no time and go to some of the questions that have been asked by our esteemed audience. I will not go question by question, but let me just perhaps regroup these comments and then go back to the panel. So first of all, there are a few questions about Europe itself and how Europe evolved. And for instance, one specific question I read here is what the role of Europe's strategic autonomy or strategic sovereignty, of whatever slogan you want to use, but how will that play into the future of transatlantic relations? Especially also, and that is a question for Baron Frans van Daele, Will it please the United States to see that Europeans are also investing in their own defense, thanks to mechanisms like the European Defense Fund or PESCO? Does that give us more credibility in that respect in Washington? And also for you, Ambassador Van Daele, the question is, if you were suddenly to become the new EU ambassador in Washington, what would be your top priorities? Following this, there's a lot of questions about China for our panel as well. Many people wonder what or how Europeans and Americans can cooperate to counterbalance the rise of China in different domains. How do we do that? But also, for instance, what is the role of NATO, US-EU cooperation through NATO vis-a-vis China? That also is a point of interest for our audience. And last but not least, I also want to mention this. Some people say that under a Trump administration, Europe perhaps lost some trust. So will we, under a Biden administration in Europe, suddenly become US enthusiasts again? And will that also mean that Europeans will more easily align with US positions when it comes to the Middle East or Asia? Will we see eye to eye thanks to this new administration coming in? So that's a first group of questions that I want to raise, and perhaps Baron Van Daele, may I ask you to start and answer these comments?
Well, these comments on the European Union. The role of strategic autonomy is something which we are after, because it's just an attempt to increase our common weight. This has always been a difficult operation for the simple reason that we are so many nation states, and giving up power and pooling power is always a painful exercise. Abandoning power is like abandoning money. But still, the strategic autonomy is progressing step by step. A number of the proposals the French Macron made are being implemented. As far as the relationship with the United States is concerned, the more we do as European countries together, that will have a mechanical effect on the balance of power across the Atlantic. And my hope, but that's just a personal opinion, is that over time we may end up with a different rapport de force, which I call, with the reference to 19th century diplomacy, which I'll call a new entente cordiale. And I think that would help in a way to achieve critical mass, because I'm deeply convinced that as matters stand, neither the United States alone nor the European Union alone is strong enough to really influence what happens around the planet. Yes, the United States always asks us, for the reasons I fully understand, to increase our defense spending and our defense effort. The only hidden angle is that the United States, up till now, always wanted the Europeans to do more, but they did not want them to do that together. It was only during the Clinton years with Madeleine Albright that an attempt has been made to overcome this fundamental contradiction with the Berlin Plus agreements. And you had another one for me?
If you were to become the new EU ambassador to the United States, what would be your priorities?
I think I mentioned them in my introductory remarks. First of all, I would go for early harvest and low-hanging fruits, like the return of the United States to the climate agreements, and I would very carefully prepare the ground for China, because that's a much more difficult nut to crack.
Well, that is very clear. Thank you very much. Walter Russell Mead, your thoughts on some of the questions that were raised?
Walter, you have to unmute. Yeah.
Yes. That's so hard for me to unmute. Look, I think that the problem of, in some ways, the problem of European strategy, and I don't actually disagree with Constanze about not wanting to overemphasize Germany, but it remains the case that Germany needs to develop and articulate a clear view of where it would like itself and Europe to go, not because that's going to force everyone in Europe to work in that exact way, or that it would be the German ambition to develop their idea and then try to impose it. That's not the way the Germans are thinking about these things. But that right now there's a sense, at least I get a sense that the status quo is so profoundly benign from a German point of view, even though there's some irritants and problems, that almost any change would make things worse. And therefore one would basically like to do as little as possible and do it as slowly as possible. That's changing. But I still find, and again, the split between the kind of elite discourse, which has moved farther ahead, and the public perceptions and popular view is immense. And I'm not sure that it's narrowing. So, and on questions like defense and sort of national strategy, an elite can only go so far without getting more popular buy-in. Mm-hmm. So I think in some ways, when the questions about European strategic autonomy and so on are posed in a French accent only or largely, there is a certain basic suspicion that pops up in the United States, and perhaps not even only in the United States, that there may be, some egotism or some other agenda at work. And of course, when Americans hear Macron says, okay, the time has now finally arrived for European strategic autonomy, it's hard to forget that we heard Charles de Gaulle say pretty much exactly the same thing or very similar. Mm-hmm. So in that sense, a strong German voice in the view of how Europe proceeds is, I think, necessary in order to have the deep transatlantic conversation that is required, as well as I think it's a necessary element of a European conversation. So,
Professor, also in China, is there a transatlantic strategy to China? Is this possible, or are Europeans and Americans too divided vis-a-vis this topic?
Well, I actually think of Xi Jinping as one of the great unifiers of our time, that even during the Trump administration, you could see European and American views on China moving clearly together. Only a very great statesman could accomplish this, and Xi Jinping seems to be of that caliber. One might even say not since Kaiser Wilhelm II has a leader appeared with this kind of ability to unite the world. And currently, as China exercises its considerable charms on Australia, the world is getting a terrific vision of what a Chinese-led world order might look like. Mm-hmm. So I actually think, again, in many ways, it was the Soviet Union that held Europe and the United States together during the Cold War, more than our own virtues or strong abilities of statecraft. And China is now trying to work this magic. It's going to be different and trickier. For one thing, a U.S. policy that's focused primarily on the Indo-Pacific is going to have to be a little bit less Western, if I can use that phrase. For one thing, I had a conversation with the Indian foreign minister about a year ago, back when one could still go places. And what he said to me is, look, if you want to help keep us safe from China, balance China, we're with you. But if what you're trying to do is Europeanize the world or Westernize the world, we don't want any part of that. Now some of that reflects maybe some particular positions of the Modi government that are not shared universally in India. Nevertheless, if the West comes to Asia with the idea that some I think still cling to, that America and Europe are the power couple who rule the world. America is the dad with the hard power, and Europe is the mom with the soft power. But the two of them are the parents, and the rest of the world are the children. If we come to the Indo-Pacific with an idea of the West or our policy that is in any way, shape, or form like that, we will not help anyone, including ourselves. This is a much bigger problem for Europe, I think, than it is for the United States, because that idea of being the mom of the global power, works very well with a lot of sort of, with both the strategic and structural realities of the European situation, but also with some of the cultural and emotional elements. It's a nice role. It's a good role. It is both powerful and it is kind. So America sends Iran upstairs without any supper, and then mom comes up later with milk and cookies. They're on the same team, but mom is the healer. So I would say that we will have to manage, we will have to think about what it means to be the West in a global strategic situation that is not focused on the West.
Okay, thank you very much, Professor. So Constanze, over to you.
Yeah. Okay, let me briefly continue where Walter left off and then say something about Germany. I think that is exactly right. A good cop, bad cop division of labor between America and Europe is not just not going to work in Asia and the Indo-Pacific, it's not going to work anywhere. The thing that the Europeans I think have understood, and this is shown both in the just published European Union Transatlantic strategy paper and I think in much of what the German leadership have been saying over the last 3 weeks. It has become very clear that there will be a regional division of labor, which leads to Europeans taking on some extremely hard security provision issues, particularly in Northern Africa, the Middle East, perhaps South Asia, with minimal American military and hopefully a lot of diplomatic and political support, but that still will be extremely difficult for Europe. At the same time, we cannot afford to, I mean, nobody, I think at this point is pretending that it is in Europe's interest, or for that matter, Germany's interest, for America to be on its own in the Indo-Pacific. Not least because we have interests of our own there, some of which are aligned with America's, some of which are not. And we're going to have to thrash those out. But in other words, I mean, forgive me for being brutally frank here, but I think that the one thing that the populists have taught us is that the notion of a regaining of full sovereignty, coupled with the ability to uncouple one's country from globalization and its risks and travails, is illusory, even for a major power and even for a superpower. You can do mitigation. You can unpick some of the tentacles of globalization, but not all of them. And our destiny is friction in deepening interdependence. And that, I think, has limited the power of the US in absolute and relative terms in ways that force the Europeans to step up to the plate. And that is very much seen in Europe, and it's very much seen in Germany. If you can pretty much see a concerted volley of very detailed, specific and operational offers down from the German president via the chancellor, via op-eds by the German foreign minister together with the French foreign minister, and some extremely detailed speeches by the German defense minister. Bizarrely, the French president has taken it upon himself to criticize the German defense minister, who's not on his level of status, for being too transatlantic. What I think he fails to understand is that this generation of German politicians are actually France's best friends in this. And that sort of getting hooked on these theological distinctions and not understanding that the Germans are saying, we know what needs to be done here and we're here for it, I find mildly tragic. That said, Walter is right, that European public opinion is in a different place. And I think one of the mistakes that German politicians have made in the past is not to educate the public on what is in store for all of us. Mm. Now, I will say that Merkel, whom I've criticized for failing to do this in the past, I think has really changed her tone on this in the last 18 months or so. And again, here it helps to have reporters in Germany who speak German. She has done a lot of public speaking about the religious wars of the Baroque period and the early modern period in Europe, which were ended by peace treaties and then ended up mired in another 30 years of religious war. Her point being that if we do not salvage the institutions of European and global cooperation now and make them resilient against future crises, we risk being mired again in conflicts that are potentially just as horrific or more horrific than the great wars of the 20th century. Mm-hmm. If that's not clear, I don't know what is.
Mm-hmm. Well, thank you very much for those thoughts. Let me take another round of questions. There's many comments coming in. Once again, I tried to regroup a little bit all the questions coming in. Some of our audience are actually noting that perhaps over the past years, European perceptions about the United States have nosedived. Perhaps those perceptions have changed a lot. So people wonder, how do we actually convince Europeans to reinvest trust and confidence in the United States? This is one question we got. Also, some of our audiences are pointing at the relationship with Russia. We've talked about China, but what about Russia? There's a concrete question about whether the United States plans or can actually reset relations with Russia, or at least evolve to a more constructive dialogue with the Kremlin than is the case today. And last question I want to take as well is also our audience is wondering how the GOP will develop in the coming years. Will Trumpism prevail, and how will this impact United States approach to the transatlantic relationship? So Baron van Daele, let me perhaps again start with you, and if you have some comments on some of these questions raised. Thank you.
Well, the European perceptions of the United States, first of all, are not monolithic. They change from one political current or group to another, and secondly, they change over time. But basically, the broad sense of having a common interest and common values and common destiny, or whatever you want to call it, is still very much there. So it is a broad-based relationship. And to improve it, if Biden succeeds in doing all the things he announced, that will, of course, be extremely profitable to this transatlantic relationship. By the way, it's not about good cop, bad cop. It is about the simple fact that we have a number of tools in our toolbox, which is incomplete. The United States has other tools. How can you make them work together? And mind you, there is a very beautiful Renaissance painting in the Getty Museum in Los Angeles, where you see the god Mars being disrobed by the goddess Venus, and it's called Marte disarmato da Venere, Mars disarmed by Venus. But that's just a joke on the side. Russia, I think we just in a way, we will have to let Russia stew in its own juices. That seems to me probably the most profitable Russia policy. Will Trumpism prevail? Well, if you see the number of people who have voted for outgoing President Trump, if you see the widespread of what I call, by want of a better word, populist feelings, the feeling of so many people, and not only in the United States, because we have exactly the same phenomenon on this side of the pond, is that the number of people who feel that they are left out in the sense that they don't understand the decisions taken. These decisions don't match with their guts feelings. They feel that decisions are taken above their heads. It's of course an obvious, the obvious ground for populism, and populism will continue. And so Trumpism or Tea Partyism, which is a more, I understand, a less virulent form of the virus, I think will continue, and that will be one of the problems President-elect Biden will have to deal with, and which reduces his margin of maneuver. Voilà.
Thank you very much. Walter Russell Mead, over to you.
Well, on the future evolution of the GOP, I do think obviously Trump is going to continue to be an influential force. But he is also almost as old as President-elect Biden. And, you know, so I don't know how long the sort of personal energy will hold. So one has to distinguish, I think, between Trump the individual and Trumpism as a political phenomenon. I do think that in some respects, we will continue to see a populist veto over certain kinds of things that the US does. It's important to remember that when the Kyoto Protocol came before the Senate, it was defeated 95-0. And that there are, you know, the easy part of climate change in some ways is to just sort of, okay, let's all have some targets. But a lot of the hard part of climate change involves, let's send money to developing countries to help them pay for the adjustment, which in politics will often sound like, let's subsidize the competitors who are stealing our jobs. And that's a very, very difficult thing to get across. So I think you're going to see a continued populist break on the speed at which the United States is able to move in certain directions under Biden. On Russia, I would agree that it's up to Russia in some ways to decide what its interests are and who the partners are who can best help it move forward. I would actually make a strong case that the West is a better partner for Russia than any other partner to be found anywhere in the world. But it doesn't matter if I believe that. The question is, what do the Russians believe and how do they see things? So every US president from George W. Bush on has tried to build a positive relationship with President Putin. So far, none of them have found the magic key that opens that door. I don't know what President Biden's prospects are, but I do think the future of that relationship is clearly in President Putin's hands.
Thank you very much. Constanze?
Well, a number of big issues here. I think the problem with Russia is one where genuinely the situation of, in fact, actually this is true for Russia and China, for both Russia and China. The situation of Europe in relation to either is quite different from that of America. With the case of Russia, this is a problem of location. And by that I mean we share a continent with the Russians, and there is no longer an Iron Curtain and a Berlin Wall to divide us and to keep Russia from exercising influence in all sorts of ways that it used not to be able to exercise influence in Europe. And so we're seeing that Russia, with non-military means, asymmetric means, hybrid means, has been able to do quite a lot in the European theater. It's mostly opportunistic and destructive, but it's been quite effective in the sense that it has helped to split Europeans and to defeat attempts to create European cohesion. And it turns out the Chinese have become even more effective at this and more strategic, because they have been buying up physical and digital real estate, which they also use for political purpose within Europe. And this is a genuine difference between America and Europe that we are going to have to bridge somehow if we want to arrive at a transatlantic common purpose. Also, I think one of the things that we need to consider is, what does it mean for our strategies toward Russia and China if we consider that there are significant weaknesses in both systems? The problem is not just Russian and Chinese effectiveness or force, it's also weakness, or rather a combination of all those. That is going to make it very, very difficult to find coherent approaches. And the mobility of, goods and data and people and ideas from Russia and from China within our own polities makes a real difference. And it's something that George Kennan did not have to contend with. So at the same time, I want to say that I was talking about the sort of, oddly, the triumph of democracy that was the American election earlier. Let's not forget that there are democratic movements in non-Western countries, including in Russia and including in China and China's periphery. But democratic movements that we ought to be able to reach out to declare our affinity with, to protect, to support, from Belarus to Hong Kong and Taiwan. And again, we risk undermining our own credibility if we're not capable of doing that. And finally, on the GOP, Walter, yes, Trump may not have as much of a political future personally as he would like to think. But I think Trumpism does. And what concerns me about Trumpism is not the fact that it's not, it's not democratic, or it's not sort of Republican in the old traditions of Republican internationalism, social conservatism, of neoconservatism. What concerns me about it is the meanness, the banality, and the cruelty. That to me is, if I may say so, un-American and profoundly unliberal. And it's, here I'm a student of Judith Strauss at Harvard, who always said that the ultimate point of representative democracy was the prevention of cruelty. And I think what we've seen in the last 4 years is a renaissance of cruelty on the societal, economic, and even political level, and in political language, that I find not just distressing on a personal level, and distressing because I'm a German and the child of war children, but because I think it is potentially a terrible harbinger of things to come. It's moved the needle of what is acceptable. It has broken taboos that we thought were sacrosanct. And this can poison the Republic. And if the Republican side of the aisle doesn't get a grip on this, if it continues to permit, to enable, to deny, to ignore all this, that could still be the end for republicanism in this country. And I mean republicanism in the 18th century here. Sorry to be so glum, but something I feel strongly about.
Thank you very much, Constanze. And I'm sure you're providing everyone here serious food for thoughts. So thanks for that. I'm afraid that our time is nearing to an end. But before we leave you, perhaps may I finish with on a more candid note and transfer to you, esteemed panel, a question by one of our viewers, Leonard Schrank. I think this might give us a nice au revoir. And very briefly, the question is as following. What would Alexandre de Tocqueville say if he was to visit America today? Baron van Daele.
He would say, "I told you so."
Very clear. Professor?
Something similar. I think he'd say how much better everything is and how much worse everything is, which was more or less what he thought democracy was as a force in the world. No slavery, women are voting, all kinds of wonderful things, but then all of this crazy stuff too. So America, I think he would say, has become more itself than ever. And that's both a good and a bad thing.
Yep.
Thank you very much.
I'm gonna just sign off on that. Very nicely put.
Copy paste. Okay, great. Well, we are at the end of this event, actually slightly over time, but I think, you know, this was a good thing to do because I know I found it intellectually extremely stimulating. And, you know, I regret there's no more time for questions, but I do congratulate you, the audience and the panelists for the ideas that you did raise. Surely this will not be the last event on this theme, on this topic. You know, we at GMF will certainly continue to organize debates and discussions around that. Before I leave, I want to thank our panelists again for your time. Thank you, the viewers, for joining us. Our partners, the US Embassy to Belgium, thank you very much for your support. And last but not least, I also want to thank my own team that made this possible, Alexandria and Alberto. Thank you very much for bringing all of us together today. So I wish you, depending on when you are, a very good morning or a very good evening. And I'm sure our paths will soon cross again. Thank you very much. Have a good day. Bye-bye.